This is Star Ocean, the Divine Force. Now, I am a longtime Star Ocean fan. I'll go ahead and admit right off the bat, I've loved these games since the beginning, even though they tend to have some problems in terms of story and characterization and a couple of other things. But the last release, I know, was not very well received. I believe it was called Integrity and Faithlessness. I did not actually play that one. The last one I played was The Last Hope, which I quite liked, despite the fact that about halfway through the story gets real weird. But it is still a pretty fun game in my opinion. But yeah, this is the newest entry, and in my opinion so far, it's basically like the Tales of Arise of the Star Ocean games, by which I mean it's like a return to form compared to the previous entry that remembers what people liked about the series and also adds in some more quality of life and other modern facets to sort of improve the experience. Now, even as a long-time lover of JRPGs, I have to admit that the genre has been behind the curve in terms of quality of life changes, kind of like fighting games, honestly, where a lot of the things that are considered sort of normal, usual things by now in other genres are just sort of starting to happen in that genre. That's just kind of how it's working right now, and unfortunately that means that there are some design decisions that are kind of baked into older JRPGs that make them a little bit harder to go back to if you're used to modern games. So it's always nice to see games like this actually push that envelope forward a little bit and include some more modern quality of life changes, like just as a quick example, the ability to fast travel from your quest log to the actual NPC once you've completed a quest directly. And also, of course, things like batch buying and selling, which is always a useful feature. So just little quality of life features like that. But aside from that, the game is pretty classic in terms of its Star Ocean style. You are mostly on a single planet this time around rather than multiple planets, but it is a very, very large one. And it has a lot of very wide open environments that are ripe for exploration, but we'll get into all that in a little while. First off, what about the story? Because, of course, the story is very important in a JRPG. That's mostly what you're there for. And the story in this game is, in my view at least, actually pretty good. And I'll go ahead and qualify that what I consider a good JRPG story is a story that by the end of it, I still understand what's happening. Because I know the stereotype is that a JRPG story starts off about the power of friendship and ends up about a bunch of teenagers going to kill God, and it gets real weird. So I know that that's kind of the perception of JRPG stories, but in this case, I think the story is actually pretty grounded, mostly because it manages to expand its overall reach. It becomes about a bigger picture without going totally off the rails into crazy nonsense territory. Without spoiling any major plot points or big reveals or anything, it starts off the story about a more advanced person crash landing on an underdeveloped planet and having to sort of embroil themselves in the politics of this planet with a kingdom that is suffering the aggressions of an empire and slowly revealing that the people of that empire actually don't want war at all, and there's some other stuff going on, including some off-worlders that are actually making this whole thing happen and orchestrating a much more large-scale plot, and it eventually culminates in what are sort of like reverse Borg. They're mechanical life forms that want to actually assimilate organic parts into themselves to learn more about the world, and it's actually really not a bad story in my view, but I think the thing that it does best is the focus on individual characters, because of course you have quite a large selection of characters that you're going to be playing, and they all get pretty good characterization. And a lot of JRPGs, there's this problem where there's always that one character that you never use, that's sort of stuffed in the back of your party, that doesn't appear in cutscenes and doesn't talk much, and is just kind of happy to be there and doesn't really matter all that much. But I find that in this game that's very much not true, and pretty much every character is involved in all of the major cutscenes all the time, so it actually feels like you're a cohesive group of people learning about each other and adventuring together. And I haven't found that there is one of those one guys. There is no that one guy that no one cares about. And a focus on the individual struggles of these characters slowly expanding out to see the bigger picture makes the story feel a lot more grounded than a more like immediately cosmic scale strange story. So I think that that focus actually helps keep it on track and helps keep it from totally going off the rails into weirdness territory. But what about the combat? Because combat is something you do a ton in any JRPG, and, well, combat in Star Ocean games has always been a little bit different from the traditional turn-based menu selection style. It's usually more of an action RPG real-time kind of idea, sort of like the Tales games, and in this case, the combat is actually the high point of the game. It's really, really good combat. It uses an action RPG-like system, but mixed with the sort of create-your-own combo system that Godhand has, where every character has 12 different slots that they can put different active skills into in whatever order that you want. So you have X, Y, and B buttons. You have 3 slots for each, and you also have an additional slot for holding that button down. And you can just select from all of the different skills and spells that character has unlocked, and you can put them in any order you want and make your own combos. It's a really fun system. It works pretty much exactly like Godhands' system of just making up whatever you want and going from there. And it makes the combat a lot of fun to actually engage in, which is, of course, good because you're doing it a lot. Also, there's the fact that every character that you have plays entirely differently from each other. They all have very different mechanics to them, and honestly some pretty unique ideas as well. One of the main characters, Leticia, the princess, is a sort of fast dual sword-wielding character that has lots of combos, can enchant her swords with different elements, and also has a lot of dashing and diving attacks that cover a lot of distance and sweep enemies in sort of like a cleaving area around you. Whereas you have someone like Midas, who is the spellcaster of the group, the sort of black mage, who has a ton of offensive spells, but they have very long spellcast times, especially spells like Spicule, which is basically like a meteor spell, but it turns you into the meteor. It's very powerful. But, of course, because it is a JRPG, in addition to all of these combos you can create yourself, there's also several other mechanics that layer together to make the combat more interesting. And one of these is Duma, which is that adorable little white orb thing that's following you around. Duma is used in combat and in exploration, and in combat it allows you to do several different things, including use this VA gauge that you'll see building up in combat as you do damage, and you can use this gauge for several different things. They're all on the R1 button. Holding the button down allows you to float wherever you want. You can basically fly during combat, but it takes the gauge over time as you do this, and it also erects a barrier around you that allows you to stop attacks from hitting you for a while, but of course they take bursts out of the gauge whenever you do this. This is very useful against like spellcasting enemies that will be throwing tons of projectiles at you and things. It allows you to not flinch while you're advancing. But you can also release the button to do a big dash forward, and every character has a different, it's called a synchro skill. It's basically like a dash attack that works differently for everyone, but uses a big chunk of this gauge to do some sort of big opening dash attack. And for the main character, Leticia, for instance, or one of the main characters, there are 2 you can choose from, it is a sort of big sweeping attack that is in keeping with her other attacks and has a ton of knockback associated with it, so it's very useful for interrupting spellcasters and other things like that. But someone like Midas, like I mentioned, it actually allows him to reposition himself and move around the battlefield while still casting. Normally, characters cannot move while casting spells, but they decided to give the character with the longest cast times the ability to actually move around while casting and still continue the cast animation so that you can actually reposition yourself or get out of danger or something like that and not interrupt the spell, which is really cool. So this system allows each character to feel very different from each other because not only do they all have their own individual combos that you can create yourself, but they all have a different VA skill that alters how you might want to use them. Another example is the android character Elena, who has a sort of rushing single target damage attack that analyzes the enemy when you hit them, sort of like the scan spell from Final Fantasy, showing you their weaknesses and stuff. This is also tied into the blindside system, which the tutorial doesn't explain very well, I'll admit, but once you get used to it, you'll sort of get it. Basically, whenever you're doing one of these rush attacks using the VA gauge towards an enemy, they will focus on you, and you can use the left stick while you're dashing to change directions mid-dash, and if you do this just before you hit them and manage to get out of their cone of vision, you'll blindside them, which will stun them in place for a while, and it will double your damage against them. This is actually a necessary method to actually making the combat work. You need to be constantly dashing around the field using these blindsides to your advantage because they will interrupt and stun everyone that you blindside and drastically increase your damage against them. So this is how you capitalize on big, impressive, like movement-based moments in combat, is just dash around the place, blindside the whole group, and then sweep through them all and kill them really fast. What this all means is that the combat is extremely offensively focused. You do have some defensive maneuvers like the aforementioned barrier, the ability to dodge roll, which does give you immunity frames for a short time, but for the most part, a lot of what you're doing is offensively based. Another example of this is the fact that you can choose to not put an attack in one of your combos and instead put a consumable in there, because unlike most JRPGs, using a consumable has a very long animation associated with it, and if you get hit at all, you will interrupt it, so you have to sort of get to safety before you can revive someone or something like that. It takes a while to use an item, but if you put an item use in one of your combos, it lets you use it a lot quicker. So even using consumables has an offensive tactic associated with it because you're supposed to mix it in to your other combos to make it work work more efficiently. And in fact, there are several buff items like strength potions and the like that only buff you for a couple of seconds because they're meant to be used mid-combo to finish off with a big buffed attack. And you have an AP gauge that is used to actually attack. All of your skills take a different amount of AP, so you want to craft your combos in a way that you have enough AP to actually use them. When you hit blindsided enemies, you get more maximum AP that you keep over several battles, but as you take hits, you will decrease your maximum AP, so you're encouraged to always be moving and avoiding attacks to build up this gauge so that you can extend your combos even further. What this all means is that not only is the game very offensively focused, but it's also extremely fast. Combat is a very fast, lethal affair. Even bosses tend to go down pretty quick once you actually get the rhythm down of how to avoid their attacks, how to blindside them, and how to retaliate very quickly. You've also got some other mechanics tied into all of this, like for instance, enemies without eyes, like worms, cannot be blindsided, and there are also enemies with increased awareness, like enemies with multiple heads or a bunch of eyes that you can't blindside normally, but if you wait for them to do a big, focused, unblockable attack, then during that moment you can actually blindside them because all of their attention will be focused on one specific point. So you have to actually vary your tactics around depending on what kind of enemy you're facing. And there are two other mechanics to round it out. One is vatting, which is a really weird name for what's basically a limit break. You have a vatting gauge that builds up over time, and also when you deal and take damage. There's one gauge for the whole party, so everyone fills it up evenly, and once it's full, you can switch to any character you want and use it. And these are big, huge attacks or big, huge heals, basically a limit break. Very useful. And there's also the estuary cage, which is a weird name, but it's basically a big barrier you can choose to cast over the entire party during a combat. This will make it to where the VA gauge does not replenish, and you can't do the big VA rushes and blindsides anymore, so it limits your offensive options, but it basically gives your entire party hyper armor to where you won't flinch from anything but the biggest attacks, and it'll make you take 75% damage, so you'll actually take 25% reduced damage across the board, which is a huge defensive buff. You can even use these points you can grab during exploration to improve the cage if you want to actually make it buff everyone's attack power and also to decrease the damage you take even further than the normal 25% reduction. So honestly, combat is a blast in this game. It's a really fun combat system, but of course there's also the exploration. Since the open world areas are quite large, well, it's not an open world exactly, it's a series of large open maps connected by load screens, and you're encouraged to actually fly around these things because you can use Duma to dash through the air outside of combat as well, and this is encouraged because there are loads of treasure chests and other collectible items that are high up or in odd, difficult to reach places, so you're encouraged to explore around as much as possible. You'll find these purple crystals along the various routes across the sky and things like that you can collect, and these are what you actually use to upgrade Duma's powers. And you'll also find, like I mentioned, all sorts of consumables and pick-upable materials and treasure chests and things that you can find across the place too. So you are encouraged to just dash all around the sky, and eventually you'll even get the ability to dash twice in the air to reach even harder to reach areas that you couldn't get to before. The overall world itself does have that classic JRPG feel of like big field areas and fun, quaint towns. And of course it does have a lot of side quests. It even has a pretty fun minigame that pretty much all large-scale JRPGs have to have some form of minigame that you can play. It's like a board-based game where you get these various figures that you place on the board. It's kind of difficult to explain, but it's relatively easy in practice once you get used to it, and you can upgrade your rank by fighting more and more difficult opponents. And the cool thing about the minigame is not only do you get a good amount of money for winning against other NPCs, but you actually get more pieces to better your deck of pieces, but these pieces are also equipable accessories for your party members. So the minigame actually does have combat ramifications because these pieces tend to be very powerful accessories with all sorts of passive benefits. There's also, as is Star Ocean tradition, a whole bunch of item creation types, as in like crafting of various sorts. There's 7 different item creation types, and different characters can level up different disciplines. Whenever a character levels up, they get SP, and SP can be spent on a very large skill tree that has all sorts of passive increases to their skills, as well as new active skills, new passives, and new combat abilities that you can mix into your combos. But in addition to this, you can also use SP to strengthen all of your known combos and active skills to make them stronger, and you can also increase the level of the character's known crafting disciplines. So there's stuff like smithing, which every character has, because each character can make a sort of ultimate weapon for themselves, and you have to actually level up their smithing all the way up to 10 in order to be able to make it. But there's also stuff like engineering and compounding and authoring. There's just a bunch of crafting disciplines, so if you like crafting items, there's a very robust and highly varied crafting system in this game to actually come to terms with. as is, like I mentioned, Star Ocean tradition. That's pretty much standard. There's always a bunch of different item crafting disciplines to use. Not only that, but another Star Ocean tradition that's kept in this game is a very robust post-game content. So there's a ton of stuff to do after you beat the game, not just New Game Plus. There's also like entire post-game dungeons that are very challenging and post-game super bosses to actually face, including some names that you'll recognize if you've played Star Ocean games before. Overall, I think it's a fantastic addition to the Star Ocean series. I think it's a great return to form after the previous game didn't perform very well, but it also mixes in some really fun, modern elements like the combo creation system and stuff that elevates it above. I think, honestly, it's probably the best Star Ocean game since Till the End of Time. At least that's my personal view on it. I think it's a really, really solid entry. I haven't personally experienced any bugginess or instability that I can talk about, but one word of warning, this is a very shader-heavy game, which means that some CPUs or some graphics cards may have trouble running it. It's really shader-heavy, so it can cause some stuttering and stuff like that on lower-end systems. The first time you launch the game, it actually compiles the shaders for your individual system. You only have to do it the one time, the first launch, but it does take a while. It took my PC about 15 or 20 minutes to compile them all, and this will heavily reduce the stuttering if you have a good system, but it is something to be wary of. So yeah, that's Star Ocean the Divine Force. I think it's a really awesome return to form for a series that I have a lot of love for, even though it's a more niche JRPG that isn't ever going to be as popular as like Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest. I still really enjoy these games, so I'm always happy to see an entry actually do really well and be more well received compared to the last one, which was apparently quite underwhelming to a lot of people. So yeah, the link will be in the description, of course, below this video to the Steam store page if you wish to check it out. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.